right, we're at 9. Let's get started. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the BRO seminar series. I'm honored to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Joshua White, talking about induced seismicity and carbon storage, moving towards improved risk assessment and risk mitigation strategies. Before we start, let me give a brief introduction about Joshua. Dr. Joshua White is a research scientist at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. His research focuses on integrating large-scale computing with geophysical monitoring to improve our understanding of complex geologic systems with a focus on geological carbon storage and induced seismicity. He received a BS in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Princeton University and an MS and PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering from Stanford University. He joined Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory in 2009 as a Lawrence postdoctoral fellow and now serves as group leader for the subsurface flow and transport group at the lab. He is a member of the editorial board of the International Journal of Numerical and Analytical Methods in Geomechanics and Acta Geotechnica. He is also the Induced Seismicity working group lead for the U.S. Department of Energy National Risk Assessment Partnership. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Joshua. Joshua, you are welcome to share your screen and start your talk.
Well, thanks again for inviting me this morning. It's been a challenging year not to get to interact in person nearly as much as we might have in the past. But virtual opportunities like this are really great. So I'm honored and excited to participate. Today I wanted to talk about induced seismicity and carbon storage. This is a topic I know many people in the audience are actually deeply aware of. So I may not actually be saying anything new, but I want to kind of cast it in a certain way that maybe will prompt some good discussion. So in terms of my research background, my background is actually in geomechanics and reservoir engineering. So in terms of my specific work, I like to think about the hydromechanical interactions that go on in subsurface reservoirs. And so here we've got a nice sort of schematic cartoon of a carbon capture and storage system where we have some point source of CO2, here a power plant, that's capturing and stripping off CO2, transporting it to some injection well, and then injecting it into a deep subsurface reservoir. And as we perturb these systems, there's all sorts of hydromechanical interactions that we need to pay attention to. So things like well integrity, stress-dependent permeability, hydraulic fracturing or potentially hydraulic shearing, the bulk deformation of the system, which may be useful for deformation monitoring. And then specifically today, I want to talk about fault reactivation and induced seismicity. This has obviously become a major concern in the United States because of our experience with wastewater disposal and some other subsurface technologies. Now, what's interesting, this is a nice cartoon. I use it frequently to talk about the various sort of interactions that may occur in the system. It's clear when this cartoon was drawn, it was really focused on leakage, viewing faults as a potential leakage pathway, wells as a potential leakage pathway. Conveniently here, you'll see that none of the faults actually extend below the reservoir into basement, even though from a practical experience, we actually know many of the problematic faults we actually face are below the reservoir, potentially in the brittle basement or more brittle units. So cartoons are never perfect. So I think we live in an interesting time for CCS. I view carbon capture and storage as actually a relatively mature technology. There's been dozens of demonstration projects around the world. If you include CO2 EOR, we've actually stored hundreds of megatons of CO2 in the subsurface already. But we haven't yet seen that sort of rapid escalation in the number of projects necessary to really have an impact on global emissions. And so it's worth kind of thinking about why that is and how that might change over the next few years. And I know the BEG is actually, sort of an expert in deploying many of these demonstration projects. So I would love to hear your thoughts about what the real hurdles are. In my mind, there's actually kind of four major ones. The first and probably the most obvious one is just, the need for policy and then financial commitment to mitigating climate change. If you can't make money storing CO2 in the subsurface, it's very hard to convince anyone to do it. That has definitely changed recently, though. Certainly in the US, we have now the federal tax credits through Q45. I'm in California right now, where we have this low carbon fuel standard, which provides very appealing incentives for injecting and storing CO2 in the subsurface. And so all of a sudden, actually, we've seen a lot of interest, a lot of commercial projects being put together in California, and hopefully elsewhere around the country in this new environment. And hopefully with a new administration that's very committed to climate change, we may also see additional incentives coming down the line. The next challenge, which is hopefully will also be easily resolved, but it is an interesting one to think about, is the challenge of doing source to sink partnership development. At the end of the day, people who own CO2 sources really often know very little about the subsurface, and vice versa. People who have the technical capability of injecting fluids in the subsurface most often don't actually own a CO2 source. There may be a few, oil and gas majors who may have, let's say, a refinery and also, oil and gas fields. But more often than not, we have this challenge of trying to put together different companies and enterprises with a transport operator in the middle, and that sort of partnership development can be really challenging. Again, hopefully as projects come together and we begin to set up maybe CO2 storage hubs, some of that partnership challenge goes away. Okay, then more specifically about geologic storage projects themselves, I think two things that we face are relatively slow project permitting timelines, and then challenges around public perception of CCS and risk communication issues. And in particular, I think induced seismicity is very relevant to these topics. Getting a Class 6 permit to put CO2 in the subsurface takes a very long time. Now, some element of that is required. We need to do our due diligence to really understand the subsurface, characterize it, do the risk assessment, and put in place good risk management plans. And that all takes time. But there's also, I think, a challenge that oftentimes there's very few of these permits that have been written in the US. We don't have good templates for what they should look like. The regulators, the operators doing this, it's oftentimes the first time they've done it. For the regulators, in some sense, it's also sometimes the first time they've done it. And there's a lot of back and forth about what an appropriate permit really looks like. And so to the extent that we can begin to templatize these applications and the process of getting a project going, I think we can then start to accelerate those permit timelines. And then lastly, given that CCS is it's an old technology, but it's new to the public and it's new at the scale that we're talking about, public perception and communication about the risks involved will be critical, I think, to large scale deployment. Fortunately, though, I think we're in a good place. For many decades, CCS has really been pitched as a solution to the energy production problem. But in the near term, actually, it's more likely to be the solution for all of our industrial emissions, all of those emissions that we can't offset through other means. And there's really no shortage of opportunities in the US. We've got great storage potential. So here, this is a nice map from NETL showing, several of the large aquifer basins in the US in the sort of yellowish color. In green, we've got existing EOR wells, which would suggest, good EOR opportunities. The circles here are various types of sort of potential industrial point sources for CO2. And then in the lines here are existing pipeline infrastructure that potentially could be expanded or reused for transporting CO2. So, in terms of capacity, there really is no technical hurdle here. But I think it's worth showing another map. So this is the USGS forecast for ground shaking intensity for 2016. So this was kind of at the, let's say, the height of the shale boom. And so what this map shows is basically a estimate of the probability of seeing a certain level of ground shaking in a given year. Here I live in California. I'm up here in the Bay Area. So we have a very high natural risk of seismicity, as many of you are aware of. The middle and eastern US generally has a quite low risk, but there are certain areas. So for example, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but this kind of hotspot at the southern tip of Illinois, that's the New Madrid seismic zone, which is an active seismogenic zone. But what's interesting is if you look here in southern Kansas and Oklahoma in particular, and then maybe some parts of Texas and a few other spots around the country, with the increase in oil and gas production from shale and then the corresponding increase in wastewater disposal, we saw a rapid increase in the incidence of induced seismicity in certain parts of the country, particularly in Oklahoma. And it was to the point that the USGS actually started including those induced events in the hazard forecast, because all of a sudden the hazard in Oklahoma was actually quite comparable to the hazard in many parts of California. And so this has gotten better in recent years, fortunately, for two reasons. Regulatory authorities were fairly quick to act, so now there's stringent policies around, shutting in problematic wells, some real thoughtfulness about where we should be injecting and how deep and so forth. And then the other big thing is with the collapse of oil prices, the actual volume of disposal has gone down. And so we've seen a decline here. But it remains a challenge, and as we see the pickup of potential disposal in other parts of the country, it's something to keep an eye on. And for the CCS industry, it really kind of sets the stage. It creates a context. Will large-scale CCS create similar problems? This is, I like this figure. This is a figure I saw recently, which I find a little interesting. This is the number of publications over the past, let's say, kind of 30 years that use induced seismicity as a topic. And so you can see starting in 2010 and sort of there's this rapid increase. And so while we have maybe an epidemic of induced seismicity, the worst issue is we have a whole bunch of researchers like me writing about it. So. Now, so that paints kind of like a dire picture, but that doesn't really tell the full story. We dispose of huge volumes of wastewater in the U.S. every year through thousands of wells. The vast majority of those have no seismicity issue whatsoever. Similarly, if we look at our experience with carbon storage, both through dedicated storage projects and through CO2 EOR operations. To date, we've stored permanently stored hundreds of megatons of CO2 in the subsurface. And I am only aware of one project that has actually had problematic seismicity. And so here I'm showing several projects. So these are ones you're probably familiar with: Weyburn, Aneth, Decatur, Insala. These projects deployed quite sensitive microseismic monitoring. And so they were able to detect seismicity, but the seismicity they detected was at very small magnitudes, less than a magnitude 1, certainly not sufficient to be felt at the surface. And so while there is seismicity, this is not problematic in any sense. It's actually kind of useful for understanding how pressure is migrating and how the system is responding. The one case that is interesting is this Cogdale CO2 EOR field. So it's a highly overpressured field. and they triggered a magnitude 4.4 earthquake and some magnitude 3 earthquakes. And so that certainly would be a problematic event for, let's say, a dedicated storage project. That said, there are projects in the nearby vicinity which have not had similar levels of seismicity. So I raise this to say that induced seismicity is a serious concern. It can happen. I think in many projects, there's no way that we can truly reduce the risk to zero. So we need to take it seriously. We need to put in place good management plans. But that said, it's not the type of thing that should prevent the large-scale deployment of CCS across the country or across the world. We can talk a little bit later about this concept of induced seismicity type. We often see two general categories of seismicity. One in which the fluid pressure from the injector comes directly into contact with the fault, changes the effective tractions on that fault, and maybe triggers slip. Type 2 here, we think of seismicity outside the the overpressured zone. So this is really just a poroelastic effect where the perturbed stress volume, which is larger than the perturbed pore pressure volume, is actually interacting with faults. And both are important. And so when we model and do assessments of a new storage system, we're often trying to understand both the size of the overpressured zone as well as the size of that perturbed stress zone that we need to pay attention to. Okay, so it's useful then to think about risk management. And it's useful to be a little bit pedantic about what is risk, what are the elements of risk. And so I'm going to use a specific vocabulary here to say that risk has three components. So there's a scenario of concern. There's then the probability of that scenario occurring, which we're going to call the hazard. And oftentimes, though, we don't necessarily care about the hazard itself. We care about the damage that might result from that hazard. But that's an independent thing. What is, given that hazard, what is the probability of damage happening? And so we'll call that vulnerability. And so from a seismic risk point of view, we generally think about, we have an earthquake, so that you could say that's the scenario that we care about. But it's a little bit like if a tree falls in the woods and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. Earthquakes are the same thing. If we have a small magnitude earthquake that creates no ground motion at the surface, or it's in such a remote area that it doesn't, again, create ground motion at places we care about, we would say it has a very low hazard. And so what we ultimately care about is the ground motion that's being triggered. And so that's a function of the energy released by the earthquake itself, how efficiently that propagates through the earth and how far it propagates. And then when it gets to a particular site, there may be some soil conditions that may amplify or decrease the magnitude of the vibrations and so forth. So we really care about ground motion. And then though, given a certain level of ground motion, we then, infrastructure and people have a certain level of vulnerability. And so that's very easy to see in sort of the natural tectonic hazard case. So I am currently sitting here in Oakland, California. I am more or less right on top of the Hayward Fault. So this is this bright pink zone here. What this map is showing is actually a hazard map for California. It's basically a probability of seeing a certain level of ground motion acceleration expressed in percent of G, in percent of gravity in a certain time period. And so we are in an extremely high hazard zone. And so if you just paid attention to hazard, you would say that this is probably the worst place in the world to live. But we don't just care about hazard, we care about vulnerability. So this is a photo of downtown San Francisco. This is the new Salesforce tower that was built a few years ago. We have one of the most stringent seismic building codes in the world. And so we say, well, there's very little we can do about controlling the seismic hazard, but we can actually control our seismic vulnerability. And so, we think about really good design building codes and so forth. Now, in many parts of the country, there's a limit to what we can do in terms of controlling, the design codes for buildings. So I'm not saying that the solution here is just to make buildings stronger, but I'm saying that this is an engineered system and that there are many opportunities in that system to actually sort of change how that system responds to seismicity, even if we can't guarantee that there will never be an earthquake. And so also, I'll say we often think about infrastructure, but in terms of induced seismicity, there's another key group, which is actually just the public, that when earthquakes occur, that creates a nuisance for the public, or it possibly scares the public. And so we think about the vulnerability of the public to induced seismicity. And that certainly can be modified. In California, we're so used to earthquakes. When a magnitude 4 earthquake occurs, people get excited about it. We text each other trying to guess the magnitude. People follow the USGS on Twitter, and at dinner parties, seismologists are like really, really popular. In other parts of the country, you can imagine a magnitude 4 earthquake would be terrifying. And so as we think about deploying projects and this sort of thing, things like risk communication, engaging with the public, demonstrating the value of a project, and a commitment to transparency about what is going on in the subsurface can actually build trust and can actually modify people's acceptance levels for an unexpected event. If a magnitude 2 or 3 were to occur, a community that's engaged with the project may be more amenable to project modifying operations and continuing, whereas a community who's dead set against the project would use a magnitude 3 earthquake as an opportunity to really shut it down. Moving on, maybe to look at specifically what does induced seismicity look like in the subsurface. This is not a CCS project. This is seismic data from the Paradox Valley brine disposal project. So this is basically a waste disposal project in Colorado. They want to prevent too much salt water going into the Colorado River, so they dispose of brine into a deep well here at this yellow square. And they've been doing this for 20-ish years now, for quite a while. And it's a seismically active system. Over time, they've recorded actually fairly substantial seismicity, including a magnitude 4.3 earthquake here, several magnitude kind of 2 and 3 earthquakes. But the project has continued. It provides a valuable service. It's in a relatively remote location and so forth. It's in a halt state right now, but for a very long time, this was an active project. And what's interesting, you can see here is that these dashed lines are basically major faults that were visible in active seismic at the site. But you can see the seismicity actually seems to be, we could say, lining up maybe on some lineaments here, which may be some faults that were not visible in the seismic surveys. And the best estimate we have for the stress orientation would be actually in this direction along the strike of the major faults. And so these lineaments would be well oriented for reactivation in that stress field. But it does raise, I think it kind of highlights 3 fundamental hurdles we have to effective hazard management. The first one is that faults are pervasive in the subsurface, and very often we don't actually know where they are prior to injection. CCS projects benefit from having high quality active seismic frequently, but there is a resolution to seismic. Oftentimes we can't see faults, particularly if they're strike slip faults or faults in kind of homogeneous units like the basement and so forth. And even after injection, we're not so good at recognizing hazardous faults. How do we look at a microseismic cloud and say that is a seismogenic structure, but it's not posing a huge hazard, versus that is a structure that could generate a magnitude 4 earthquake if we're not careful. The second thing is that the relationship between injection rate and seismic activity is very complex. It's very site specific. And we often don't have a lot of time to figure it out. That a key component of risk management is the ability to rapidly respond to changes at the site. Um, and then lastly, if we decide that maybe a site is more problematic than we were expecting, the number of knobs that we have to turn is a little limited. We can turn down the injection rate, um, we can stop injection, we could potentially backflow a well or do some sort of active pressure management. But all of these do take some time to take effect. And so those are challenges. And so that's why I would say, um, while it's important to focus on the hazard, we should also think about deploying projects in places that are, that have very low vulnerability, that if an earthquake were to occur, the project likely could continue, to really think about that vulnerability component uh, in complement to the hazard component as well. But again, so bleak picture, but there are lots of places where we could say there's probably a very low intrinsic hazard of injecting large volumes of CO2. So to give an example, I know folks at the BEG, Tip Meckel and Sue Havorka in particular, have been working for many years on studying the feasibility of storing large volumes of CO2 in the Gulf of Mexico region, particularly in Texas state waters. And so there's no CO2 there, but for a variety of reasons, you could say this probably has a very low intrinsic seismic hazard. So this is a structural cross-section, looking at some of the thick sandpacks in the Gulf of Mexico. First of all, there's huge porosity, very high permeability. Injecting large volumes here would likely lead to pretty minimal overpressures, and so minimal overpressure reduces the hazard. This is also an extremely ductile system. The Gulf of Mexico is a seismically quiescent system. There are very few earthquakes in the historical record compared to other parts of the country. And in fact, the earthquakes that we do see, many of them are actually probably driven more by the sediment loading process than by sort of plate tectonics and more typical tectonic activity. And then the last thing is, as soon as you go offshore, you're starting to put a buffer between the project and the nearest community that might be impacted. And so just by moving projects away from communities, you create that vulnerability buffer, which is helpful. Now, obviously, we haven't put CO2 here, so we would have to see. But my point is, I think what we will discover is that there are many places around the country, many of the demonstration projects have already shown this, we can inject CO2 and basically have zero seismic response. And if we build hubs then around those successful wells, it's likely we can really take advantage of huge capacity with almost no seismic concern. But I think there will be then sort of a next level of project, which might be something like the Illinois Basin Decatur project. So this is a project which has actually had some visible seismic response from their injection. So the project began with this CCS1 well here. And over time, several clusters of seismicity emerged. But again, this is very low magnitude seismicity, but I do think this is a good case to think about a project where if we were alarmist, we might say, oh, we're reactivating faults, we need to stop injection. Whereas a more measured and rational response, and what the IDP project did and in concert with regulators, is to say, no, let's deploy very careful microseismic monitoring. Let's monitor the system and keep an eye on it and have a very good risk management plan, but let's continue, And so they've continued, and they've actually been able to put quite a bit of CO2 in the ground. It's now continuing into the commercial phase of this project with the CCS2 well. And so I think there will be a variety of projects where we see seismic response, but we want to have good monitoring and good management in place and be able to continue. Then there'll be a third class, which would be someone, I don't know, proposing to inject CO2 into the Arbuckle in Oklahoma, which, given the observed response already, probably is a really bad idea, And so those types of projects, I think we should immediately take off the table as just simply too risky. Okay, so to come back it's a very general overview. To come back though to these hurdles, particularly around the slow permitting timeline and around this public perception and risk communication issues, we've been thinking a little bit concretely about how could we kind of address those problems, or at least help address some of those problems. And so Lawrence Livermore is part, and I'm part of this thing called the National Risk Assessment Partnership. So this is a partnership of 5 national laboratories with various experts thinking about different risks associated with carbon storage, and what are some recommended practices and tools and things that we can maybe provide to help with those risks and work with the community to really advance the state of the art. And so within our working group, recently we've been working on a recommended practices document for managing induced seismicity. And so basically, this is our 5 national laboratory view about what would be best practices for really having a good risk management plan and good seismic monitoring in place. And as you work through maybe a permit application and there's a request for a seismicity management plan, what would be appropriate things to actually include in that permit? And so we've broken it down into 7 steps. This is building off some existing work by the DOE Geothermal Technologies Office, who also put together a similar protocol for managing induced seismicity, and it follows the same 7 steps. So we begin with basically a preliminary screening evaluation. This is basically kind of a red light, green light type thing. Does it make sense to move forward here, and so forth. And I'll show a little bit about what that step 1 really looks like. Step 2 is about implementing an outreach and communication program. Again, trying to influence that vulnerability of the public, the acceptability for CCS of the nearby community. 3 is some specific guidance about actually ground motion. What are appropriate criteria for ground motion acceptability levels? Some specific recommendations about seismic monitoring. 5 then is about quantifying hazard from natural and induced seismic events. I have a star here because I'll come back to it. Some recommendations then about characterizing risks, and then 7 about what a risk-based mitigation plan might look like. And so there's been a variety of recommended practices documents kind of put out by various groups. One thing we did want to do though is we deliberately modeled it on the API recommended practices documents. And I'll show you an example, in that they're very kind of specific and concrete and a bulleted list of recommendations. They say very specifically, you should do this, or it's highly recommended that you do that. And then we've got a long explanation and commentary about why we have those bullets, but we really wanted to break it down as sort of an action plan that could specifically be followed. Now, I have a star here for step 5. Step 5 is by far the hardest one to do. It is intrinsically difficult to actually forecast the hazard from induced events. And so we have some recommendations for how to do that and how to get a handle on it. But the message I would convey is it's actually far more important to do steps 1 to 4 really well. If you're at a site where having high confidence on your forecast in order to be successful for step 5, it's probably not a good site to be at, if you know what I mean. We probably want to pick sites that we have really good confidence that it's going to be low hazard, and then we monitor carefully. And through monitoring, we then have a very good handle on our current seismic hazard. Then in general, you probably have fairly low risk, even if this step is actually intrinsically difficult to do. So to give you an image of what this recommended practice document looks like. So for each chapter, we have a brief statement of the purpose. Again, we then have our recommendations, and they follow this sort of bulleted list format. You should provide, let's say, an initial estimate of the radius of concern for seismic events and a list of potential impacts or vulnerable infrastructure within that radius of concern. So concretely, that's saying go figure out where there's, historical buildings, hospitals, um, public, cities and the public that might be vulnerable to earthquakes, and then figure out if you had a magnitude 3 earthquake, what would the ground motion radius of concern look like? If you had a 4, what would it look like? Well, if you had a 5, what would it look like? And then in doing that, you can then begin to say, well, we think this is a very low risk site and we can proceed with planning. It's a low risk site that we can proceed with planning, but we probably need some additional characterization data to proceed. Or maybe it's a red flag site that is just not really worth additional investment at the site and we should go elsewhere. This recommended practice document, so we've finished writing it. It's gone through several rounds of internal review at DOE. We're about to put it out for an external peer review because obviously we want to get peer review from the external community. Please don't be surprised if a few of you on the call actually get contacted. We would like to get input from folks who have experience both in induced seismicity, but also in carbon storage project deployment. And again, these are this National Risk Assessment Partnership. These are our recommendations, what we think are best practices. But we really want to kind of begin a conversation with the community with the goal of really coming to some sort of consensus about what a good plan looks like, so that as projects come online, it becomes a template that they can just use and reuse and very rapidly build confidence that we can get these permits in place and projects deployed. Okay, so I've probably gone on for too long already, so I'll wrap up soon. In terms of research opportunities, I think we're actually we're in an interesting place over the next few years. In particular, I think we're going to start to see some nice advances in seismic monitoring over the next few years, particularly passive seismic monitoring. There's been a lot of work on deploying dense permanent installations. Those are both kind of regional things like TextNet, for example, but then also the ability to do dense local networks because, for example, with technologies like fiber optic or dark fiber, the cost of actually deploying geophones and lots of effective geophones has come way down. And so to give you an example, this on the right here, this is an image of the DOE project. This is Poro-Tomo. And the idea was to really say, how well could we image the subsurface if we really went overboard in the number of instruments deployed? And so each one of these yellow dots is actually a nodal 3-component geophone. You can't see it here, but there was 8 kilometers of surface fiber that runs in like a zigzag pattern over this site. There was fiber optic deployed in a vertical well. And then each of these green dots was actually a VibraSeis survey that was run around the site. Just using the passive data, colleagues have done interferometry to actually look at sort of passive methods for imaging the subsurface. And this is a geothermal site, but what's interesting is you can clearly see 4D effects of the fluid movement through this geothermal site. Just from the passive, this dense fiber optic array. And then there's lots of work out there on machine learning pickers, ways for really accelerating data processing to move it in time. So I think from this idea of real-time management of induced seismicity and the need for real-time data analysis so that we can respond quickly, I think we're in a good place, and we'll see a lot of good advances over the next few years. I also think over the past several years, there's been a recognition that geomechanical modeling has to become an important part of hazard assessment and site assessment workflows. And so we've seen a lot of good geomechanical modeling tools being deployed, used more frequently in projects. And I'll say too, the level of so I work in geomechanics. I like to do really sophisticated geomechanical modeling. But to be honest, for a project hazard assessment point of view, the level of modeling that required is relatively simple. Simple poroelastic models are often sufficient, again, to understand that perturbed volume, to really understand where we should be monitoring And if we see events, is it likely a natural event, or is it possibly within our perturbed volume and the project may have been responsible? And so I think we'll see that incorporated into workflows going forward. So to end, I think, a really good site selection. I don't think that there's a shortage of good sites to put CO2 that have intrinsically low hazard. And then on top of that, having some good management practices can substantially reduce seismic risk. But I do think we have to be honest with ourselves that we cannot eliminate risk. We cannot drive it to zero. There is, if we deploy 1,000 wells, I just have the feeling that there's going to be at least one problematic well out there. And so as a community, we should be thinking about, putting good plans in place for individual projects. And then when those wells, that problematic well does appear, we should think about how we're going to respond, because it's more than just the individual damage that may be done with the site. It's also about maintaining trust in geologic carbon storage as a whole. And so if problematic wells appear, we have to, operators and regulators really have to be committed to acting swiftly and transparently, to modifying operations, really understanding what's going on, and if necessary, shutting down the well and just saying we have to move on to a better place so that we can really get to this gigaton scale level we need to mitigate the much larger risks of climate change. Things like drought, wildfire, hurricane risk, real risks that are having a concrete damage on our economy right now. And so with that, this is a general discussion. Induced seismicity is very controversial, and people bring very different perspectives to it. I know the group here has a lot of experience with it. And so I would love to have a discussion about elements here, how people see the future evolving, and things we could do to better address the induced seismicity question. So, well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joshua, for your great talk. So is there any question for Joshua? I see one from Peter. Peter has a comment. Peter, you are welcome to unmute your mic and ask your question.
Yes. So Josh, this was a great overview, giving a really good perspective on the bigger issues here. I would ask you, and this is perhaps more of a comment than a question, but in my view, to do the step one in your risk assessment, you do need to know the largest likely or possible event, right? So that takes you to step 5, where you actually try to forecast this. And my experience with where we try to hindcast, we try to understand past events using site-specific geomechanical modeling. My limited experience is there are just so many buttons to turn in those geomechanical models, at least perhaps 2 dozens, where we most cases lack the material parameters and the site-specific information that's really necessary. The models are highly sensitive to small variations in our input parameters. So they're not, it's all linear elasticity, but at the end, it's a very non-linear response of the system, especially once you put the pore-elasticity into the models, which I think you have to have. And current industry practice uses very simplistic models that, in my view, are insufficient to really address this issue. So I don't know, my question is if we agree or don't agree. You said simple pore-elastic models. I'm not sure if they exist really, because they tend to be fairly complex in detail. To me, the challenge at the moment is to have computational tools that allow us to run those pore-elastic models in short time that's needed to do site evaluation in a meaningful amount of time, and do it in a stochastic way, to do several hundreds of models. And I don't think we have the tools currently to do that. So I was wondering what your perspective is, and perhaps it sounds like it's actually different. And you're the computational person, which I'm not. So maybe you can give your perspective on my concerns in that regard.
Right. Well, yeah, so I actually have the exact same concerns as you do. That at the end of the day, we have a, okay, so there's various levels of modeling. You know, there's simple models, then you get increasingly sophisticated. And those increasingly sophisticated models have better fidelity to the true physics. They can better reproduce historical cases, but at the same time, they also require many, many more parameters, and the uncertainty is much larger. And no one has really demonstrated to date that they have a model which is truly predictive about the hazard, you know. Okay, so then I want to partition into two problems. Let's put on an engineering hat. We still have to, given that, we still have to deploy CCS projects. And so what I would say is, you know, I think what we should do is at a given site, the team should do an analysis. Just assume that there was a magnitude 3 earthquake. Just take it as a scenario earthquake. What would the damage assessment look like? How much would it cost, you know, in terms of the project? What if there was a magnitude 4? What would that look like? And then what if there was a magnitude 5, you know? I think in many sites that, you know, a magnitude 5 is a different thing, but a level of magnitude 4, the financial damages that might be incurred, I think many operators would be willing to take those on. That they would say, you know, yes, we're taking a risk, but given that we've chosen the site, it's in a remote region, where it's such a, you know, the chance of actually triggering a 5 is so low anyway, we're willing to proceed, and we will just, you know, plan for the financial risk that we may have to deal with. You know, I know that's not an ideal answer, but the answer is no one can really tell you what the maximum magnitude is that may be induced by an event, and we still have to proceed. You know. Then when it gets though to, you know, site-specific modeling, are there things that we can do better? Yeah, so we, for example, I do a lot of work on, you know, developing very fast-running, high-performance computing geomechanical models. You know, we now can run very complicated models quite quickly to the point that we can actually run thousands of ensemble models. And do that sort of stochastic analysis that you're describing. But again, the uncertainties are so I think that type of analysis is very useful. The stage 1, that type of analysis takes time, you know, and you got to pay staff to do it, and you need a lot of characterization data to make it useful. And so the difference between stage 1 and stage 5 is stage 1 is you probably haven't even drilled a characterization well. You're using like existing commercial seismic, you know, maybe existing well logs. You're trying to kind of just get an understanding. And so the level of a hazard analysis you do has to be consistent with the quantity of characterization data you have. Whereas when you're getting to level 5, you've probably, you know, drilled the well, you may have even started injecting, and you've got some ongoing data. All of a sudden, that very sophisticated modeling you can calibrate to real data, and it becomes, I think, a more valuable tool. Yeah. So unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for you. I think this, as a community, we're struggling with this. How do we deploy engineering projects in spite of this intrinsic uncertainty? Yeah, and anyone who says like, oh, I have a model that will predict M max, I just don't believe it at this point, you know.
So I guess the takeaway message is here: good subsurface characterization, right, is one need, and then having effective computational tools is another one, right?
Yes, and also I would say rapid monitoring and data analysis. Collecting microseismic data and then waiting 4 months to analyze it, the data is essentially useful.
Right.
If you have, I mean, many service companies now provide subscriber arrays where they give you a 24-hour update, QA, QC. That's the type of, like, you know, you can really respond in real time with that level of data.
Thanks.
Thanks, Joshua. I think Sue would like to make a comment.
Yeah, Josh, thanks so much for this presentation. I was cheering the whole time for the things you were saying. And I like the pragmatism of your message to tell the financiers, you know, that we can't guarantee you. You know, we can't. This isn't bridge construction. This is working with a natural system. We have uncertainty in it. something that people who do energy resources know. Some holes, some of the best wells that are some of the best characterized wells end up being dry holes. It's just in the nature of our working with geoscience. But I think the key missing thing that finance people would like to know is what's the likelihood of getting a lemon. You were saying, you and I have been agreeing that it's not that common. It makes the news, but it's not like half of them turn out to be unusable because of a seismic risk. So I wonder how we could get better data. There's always a problem because the available data are high graded to those where there was a response. So when we try to say where was injection a response in terms of seismicity detected, well, all the places that are reported in the literature have a response, right? Because nobody publishes the places that they made a measurement and got just truck noise. I know we don't. So I think that would be an interesting problem for you guys to try to chew on, and maybe you could even do it with some of these stochastic approaches. We're not going to get the data for 1,000 quiescent sites to provide the kind of probabilities that a financier needs to see, that their chances of getting a unexpected seismically active site are small, but we need to quantify that so that the next step beyond your pragmatic, just get over it, deal with the uncertainty, is to say, what uncertainty are you accepting?
Yeah, I agree. One pathway, and there's been a little bit of work on this, and it's a challenging analysis. It's not easy to do, but would be to say, there must be, I don't know how many, but let's say 10,000 permitted wastewater injection wells in the US. There are very different volumes, some low volume, some very high volume, but that is empirical experience, and the challenge there, the fundamental challenge is, how do we say that certain wells are problematic? Like, for example, in California, we inject a comparable volume of wastewater every year as Oklahoma, and people have done very careful statistical analysis, and you can identify maybe a dozen wells that are clearly kind of induced seismicity. But it's challenging because we have such like a high background rate, and there's some things you can do, but it's challenging. But if you looked at that, then you would say, well, 12 out of how many thousands? That's a pretty good proxy for what your financial risk is.
I encourage you, when you have this data, to get it together and publish it, because I think the framing as there's some risk, accept it, here's the number, is a great go ahead concept. And I hadn't really thought about it until listening to hearing you talk, that was a real viable approach.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good one.
Thanks, Joshua. So there is one question from Josimar. Could you comment on the use of CO2 in geothermal energy projects?
Okay. Not my area of expertise. There's two types of, I think, use of CO2. One would be a traditional, like an engineered a low permeability fractured geothermal system where CO2 is used as the working fluid. And then the different case would actually be, there's been some discussion about using like a high permeability aquifer dedicated CO2 storage site. But over time, that CO2 actually heats up and becomes a geothermal resource. And maybe we could like reproduce the CO2 and use that to power maybe a CO2 compressor could actually be powered from the geothermal energy at the site, that sort of green site type things. From an induced seismicity perspective, I mean, CO2 is a more compressible fluid, and so it does have an impact on the fluid pressure, but ultimately all that really matters is the fluid pressure, and then the mechanical response that results from it. And so I don't see strong distinctions between CO2 and water-based systems. I do see a strong distinction between a CO2 storage system and a small geothermal system in terms of time scale, length scale, and the geologic environment. an engineered hot, dry rock geothermal system might be in, granite or some very low permeability, brittle system. Injection pressures are very, very high above the hydraulic shearing threshold, but the time scale is extremely short for stimulation, a few days, and then the operation runs for a few years. Whereas a CO2 storage project, super high permeability, but then super large length scale, kilometers, decades. So I know that's not a great answer, but things are site specific. But the difference between CO2 and water, I view that as a pretty trivial thing compared to the hydromechanics, pressure and stress. Those are the things that really matter.
Thank you. There is one question from Jonathan. Have you looked onto what European countries have started to do for their CCS or CCUS projects with respect to hazards?
Yeah, so we're, for example, the Swiss, the group in ETH, they actually recently came out with a recommended practices document, which is quite good, and I think is similar in many respects to the recommendations we make. Other groups certainly have done the same. Yeah, and this was my point a little bit. Like, I think these. I mean, any individual group can put out a recommended practices document. I was talking to someone who made a really good point. Something, you can make a recommended practice, but it doesn't become a best practice until industry does it every day. It's best practice when the whole industry comes to an agreement that this is how things should be done. And so I think what's good is, we are kind of putting out some recommendations for discussion. Other groups are putting out recommendations for discussion. And then I think with time, we'll quickly come to a consensus. This makes sense. This is practical and affordable, but also meets the need. And hopefully then eventually you have something like API or some sort of international institution saying, let's put our stamp on this, that we really think industry-wide, this is what we should be doing. And that's much more authoritative than, a group of scientists at a national laboratory saying that this is the best thing you can do.
All right, thank you. So Mariana would like to ask a question. Mariana, you're welcome to turn on your mic.
Okay, so I know that the type 1 and type 2 induced seismicity is mainly influenced by the geology, but I'm wondering if the storage mechanism can also impact them, like whether we're doing the CO2 EOR or the permanent storage, and if that could lead to an option. Like, for instance, if we have this area with this certain geology and with this certain risk, and it's too risky for storage, but we have the option to do the CO2 EOR, maybe because it's in an open, in an open system, so the pressure won't be as high as in the storage. Yeah, I guess that's my question. Like, if the storage mechanism could lead to an option. Also, I have another question. So you talk about continuing injection with more careful plans and mitigation even after false reactivation. I'm wondering if that ever happened before, because I'm thinking that it might sound terrifying to policy or decision makers. So I'm wondering if that ever happened before, and how did you approach that, or if that hasn't occurred. Like, I'm just wondering what's the plan gonna be. Thank you.
Okay, those are both excellent questions. Yeah, so it is true that a CO2 EOR site, because let's say you're injecting and producing, the net volume that you're putting into the subsurface may be lower. Pressures therefore may be lower, the perturbations may be lower, and therefore it might be a somewhat less risky system. However, what I would say is that doesn't, some people I think then take that argument to say that CO2 EOR is intrinsically not risky at all. Oh, I've got a zero net balance. Let's say you get to zero net balance, there's no risk. Whereas as soon as you inject and produce from different wells or at different points in time, you're actually creating a stress perturbation. And so, that stress perturbation can certainly reactivate faults. And, we saw with this Cogdale site, it was an EOR site, overpressured, very, very overpressured. So it's specific to that. But my point is just that, yeah, I think CO2 EOR sites are less risky. It's a little easier to manage pressure, but that doesn't get the site off the hook from doing the careful analysis that's necessary to understand how the pressure and the stress field may respond and how nearby faults may reactivate. Yeah, but it's an excellent question. Now I'm blanking. Could you quickly remind me your next question?
Oh yeah, so it's about you talk about continuing injection.
Continuing injection.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So in the CCS context, most projects, particularly like the Decatur project, have put in place a stoplight response framework. And basically, it's an agreement with the regulator that if seismic events are below a certain magnitude, you're in a green light zone and everything can proceed. If you trigger a certain either threshold magnitude or threshold ground motion might be more appropriate, you may move into a yellow or amber zone where you'll modify operations, maybe have to slow injection, revisit, do much more detailed analysis, potentially deploy more microseismic instruments. And then there's a threshold, which is a red light, which says you stop. And so, I know certainly the Decatur project has a stoplight with certain thresholds. Future Gen didn't go forward, but they got the permit and they have a stoplight with certain thresholds. And so you can see those. I would say, so Decatur's the type where they've seen microseismicity, but it's below their stoplight thresholds, and so they can continue. Another example, not CCS, would be that Paradox Valley project I showed. They, for many years, injected at a certain rate. They then started to have enough seismicity that they were concerned that it was becoming problematic. And so they actually reduced the injection rate to 2/3 of what it was, which helped. And then they also went to this cyclic injection process, which they would inject for a certain period, shut in and let kind of the well pressures drop a little bit, and then they would inject again and then let it drop. To be honest, that cyclic thing doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I think it would have been better to just inject at a lower average rate because you're kind of jerking the system more, but doing that constant shut-in and so forth. But very clearly, when they reduced injection rate, the overall frequency of seismicity went down, even though they still continued to have large magnitude earthquakes every once in a while. So, but yeah,
Thanks, Josh.
Let me put it, if a project triggers a magnitude 2 earthquake, or is multiple times triggering magnitude earthquakes, I think it would be hard to make the argument that you could kind of continue to inject and everything's going to be okay. That would be kind of concerning. But if you're below felt earthquakes, below magnitude 2, and things are fairly consistent as they are at Decatur, I think it makes a lot of sense just to continue injecting as they are. But it's very site specific, and I'm not a regulator, so I'm not going to prejudge what are appropriate thresholds.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see a very long comment from Alex Baum. Alex, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Thanks, Sahar. Nice talk, Josh. Well done. And I'm sort of taken with Sue's comment about pragmatism, but thinking about work that I've been doing of late on repurposing depleted fields for CO2 storage. And there's a huge spectrum of what people refer to as depleted fields. But the middle of it is sort of EOR, CO2 EOR operations, and post-production storage in the same depleted reservoirs. So geologically really similar. It's just a question of timing and perhaps pressure. But they get regarded and treated as things that are very different. And Meliana may have asked something similar while I was typing. But EOR, of course, is governed by class 2 wells. It's routine, gets a little public comment, seen as low risk. Post-production storage in a depleted field is a class 6 well, as you said, long permitting, anything but routine. In other countries, it's been completely derailed by public opposition and fear of induced seismicity or whatever, right? The perception of risk is really, really different in two pretty similar scenarios. So I'm curious about your view of what the actual risk looks like and how, is the public view warranted, and is there a way to get past that, to educate from, routine operations toward the new thing that is actually pretty similar, new, but proven in a way?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, and I will say right up front, this is my personal opinion because I think, yeah, so I'm not speaking for anyone except me. My feeling is, yeah, I think that the fact that there's a distinction, well, I think it makes sense to have two permit categories, class 2 and class 6. That kind of makes sense. The disparity, though, between the level of characterization and information required between class 2 and class 6 doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I think class 2 is a little low, and class 6 is way high. I think class 2 has become almost maybe a little bit of a rubber stamp. But class 6, the burden of constantly going back to the regulator with new models, new information. I agree, and at the end of the day, the differences in the technologies are not so great that there really needs to be that substantial distinction. But to be very pragmatic, this is the regulatory environment in which we live, and I think it's very unlikely to change in the near term. And so this was a little bit my point of class 6 seems super burdensome right now because we're kind of doing like one of these at a time. As soon as we've done 50 of them, I think it's going to start to look a lot more like class 2. Because the thing about a class 2 permit is, operators in their own fields have actually probably permitted 50 wells, and so every time they do a new well, it's just like a repeat. And my hope for class 6 is it becomes a little bit like that. That there is a CO2 storage hub in the Gulf of Mexico. There's been 10 successful injection wells, and the 11th permit looks pretty similar. And so even though it's very burdensome to get, there's a lot of information in that 11th permit. It's the incremental cost, and there is not so great, and there's an economy of scale. But yeah, the whole permit discussion is really a better discussion to have with the EPA than with me.
All right, thank you.
Sorry.
Mahdi has a question. Mahdi, you're welcome to turn on your mic and ask your question. Mahdi, we cannot hear you.
Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Joshua, great presentation. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My question is about the hazard of CO2 injection versus saltwater disposal. So basically, you mentioned that because of CO2 compressibility, maybe the risk is lower. But I would like to add that CO2 has basically larger diffusivity, maybe a lot larger than water disposal water diffusivity. So this pore pressure increase can extend a lot into a lot larger area compared to saltwater disposal, just because CO2 can channelize, and basically because of larger mobility can diffuse to a larger area or get into the fault zone and extend to basement or overlying layers. So basically that can increase the hazard of reactivating that fault. Also, the other thing is the thermodynamic effect. For example, during the expansion of CO2, Joule-Thomson effect may have some cooling effect within the rock and fracture the rock. So I was wondering what would be your idea about these two things, diffusivity of CO2 or the thermodynamic effects?
No, I mean, you raise an excellent point, and I apologize if I meant to simplify and say CO2 is the same as water. My real point was that I think when you, how can I phrase this? imagine I'm at a specific site, okay? Generally, I would say for a CO2 storage operation, there's 4 kind of footprints or volumes that you need to have a good understanding on. And they come in order of increasing size. So the first one would be the thermal footprint, which you mentioned, so things like Joule-Thomson effects in the well, thermal cooling and stuff. Yeah, that creates a stress perturbation. But typically that's probably confined pretty closely to the well, just given, the thermal diffusivity of the earth. But it's there, definitely. We then have let's say the supercritical CO2 plume, so the CO2 rich plume that has a certain footprint, a certain volume, and that's important to really understand where that is, where it's migrating. Then beyond that, we have a pressurized brine plume, and that can extend way, way out. And so we need to understand where that is. And then beyond that, then there's sort of the poroelastic plume, so where the rock itself is deforming, even if we haven't necessarily direct pressure communication at the well,
Mhm.
To be honest, the thing that matters from induced seismicity point of view is really the change in effective stress. But that is influenced by pressure, saturation, temperature, all those quantities. But ultimately, it's that last indicator that matters. And so my point was, what you really need to do is a site-specific analysis, run a model with the appropriate physics to the fluids and the thermodynamics that you've got, and then assess that changes in effective stress and changes in tractions. Analysis always has to be site-specific.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
But thanks for giving me a chance to clarify that.
All right. Thank you very much, Joshua, for addressing all these questions. And thank you again for your great talk today and for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today and for your great questions. Today's talk was the last session of BRS seminar series in fall. So our spring seminar series will start on January 8th in 2021. So with that, I wish you all a happy and prosperous new year and hope to see you all again in 2021. Thank you again and happy holidays.